Hi, everyone. Welcome and good evening. My name is Lauren Artilles. On behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm pleased to introduce this virtual event with Margot Livesey, presenting her new novel, The Boy in the Field, in conversation with ALICE MCDERMOTT. I hope you're all well and safe. Thank you for joining us virtually tonight. Through virtual events like tonight's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our community and our new digital community during these challenging times. We're hosting 5 events a week right here on Zoom. And just like always, our event schedule will appear on our website at harvard.com, and you can sign up for our email newsletter for more updates. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question for our speakers at any time during the talk tonight, click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and we'll get through as many as time allows. In the chat, I'll be posting a link to purchase The Boy in the Field on harvard.com, as well as a link to donate in support of this series and our store. Your purchases and financial contributions make events like tonight's possible and help ensure the future of a landmark independent bookstore. So thank you for showing up and tuning in support of our authors and the incredible staff of booksellers at Harvard Bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. And finally, as you may have experienced in virtual gatherings these past few months, technical issues may arise. So if they do, we'll do our best to resolve them as quickly as possible. Thank you for your patience and understanding. And now I'm honored to introduce tonight's speakers. Margot Livesey is the author of a collection of stories and 8 novels, including Eva Moves the Furniture, The Flight of Gemma Hardy, Mercury, and the collection The Hidden Machinery, Essays on Writing. She is the recipient of awards from the NEA, the Guggenheim Foundation, and the Radcliffe Institute. She has taught in numerous writing programs, including Emerson College, Boston University, Bowdoin College, and the Warren Wilson Low Residency MFA program. She lives in Cambridge and is on the faculty of the Iowa Writers Workshop. ALICE MCDERMOTT's most recent novel is The Ninth Hour. She's also the author of 7 previous novels, including Charming Billy, winner of the 1998 National Book Award. Her books That Night, At Weddings and Wakes, and After This were all finalists for the Pulitzer Prize. Her stories and essays have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the New Yorker, Harper's Magazine, and elsewhere, and she is the Richard A. Maxey Professor of the Humanities at Johns Hopkins University. Tonight, we'll be discussing Margot's new novel, The Boy in the Field. One September afternoon in 1999, teenagers Matthew, Zoe, and Duncan Lang are walking home from school when they discover a boy lying in a field, bloody and unconscious. Their intervention saves his life, but in the process irrevocably changes their own as the comforting bounds of their small town and close family unravel around the intrusion of violence. Elizabeth Wetmore calls the book a deeply humane exploration of what it means to grow up, to keep secrets, to care for one another, and most importantly, what it means to hold another's heart and yours always with tenderness and mercy. And Kevin Wilson says, The Boy in the Field amazed me with its insight and the subtlety of Livesey's beautiful, almost dreamlike prose. She speaks of a sensation, quick as a mousetrap, sharp as a thorn, and I can't think of a better description of her work. So now I'm delighted to turn things over to our speakers. The digital podium is yours, Margot and Alice.
Thank you so much, Lauren. And thanks to all of you for coming this evening. I know that life under COVID can be surprisingly busy, and I'm just so grateful to you for making the time to be here today. And I'd like to begin by giving a few shout outs to a place, a time, and some people. The first time I ever came to Cambridge was to visit a friend who was living near Harvard Square. And on my first morning, I set out to look for Harvard Square. I was looking for something like Bloomsbury Square in London, and I couldn't find it. But I did find the Harvard Bookstore, and I wandered in and bought a book, John Fowles's novel, Daniel Martin. I had no sense at that time that I was embarking on a 40-year relationship. So my deep gratitude to Jeff and Linda and Carol and all the people that make the shop a place that so many of us cherish. And the time, I'm especially happy to be reading here today on August the 12th, which in Scotland is known as the Glorious 12th. It's the opening of the grouse shooting season. And this was important in my childhood because as a teenager, I earned money by working as a beater during the shooting, which I never at the time thought this is an odd choice for a vegetarian, but I just thought about the financial rewards. But this was when I met my first Americans. They paid no attention to me. I was much too much of an underling. But I did notice that they all had two trays in common. They were all terrifically wealthy and they were all terrible shots. So why they were spending their money grouse shooting was a bit of a mystery. And I want to thank my wonderful editor, Jennifer Barth. My manuscripts show up on her desk like disheveled orphans. Their hair is awry, their clothes are ragged, their shoes are unshone. And she makes them worthy of a good home. And then there is the amazing Jane Byrne, my fantastic publicist, who helps them to find those good homes. So many thanks to both of you. In an ideal world, it would make a better story if the book I had bought on my first visit to Harvard Bookstore was by ALICE MCDERMOTT. But she didn't publish her wonderful first novel, A Bigamist's Daughter, until several years later. I read it avidly and I've been reading her work ever since with huge admiration and the best kind of writerly envy. I always want to have written it myself. So thank you so much, Alice, for agreeing to be in conversation with me tonight. I'm very appreciative. I'm going to read the opening pages of the novel. It's set, as Lauren said, in 1999, and it's set in the countryside outside Oxford in England. Section 1, The Field. Here is what happened one Monday in the month of September in the last year of the last century. Matthew, Zoe, and Duncan Lang were on their way home from school. Usually they took the bus from the larger town where they attended secondary school to the smaller town where they lived. But that morning their father had said he had an errand to run and would collect them. After 15 minutes with no sign of the familiar car, they began to walk along the road that led to their town. They each wore a version of the school uniform, a white shirt, black trousers, and a black pullover. Expecting their father to appear at any moment, they walked fast, making it a game to see how far they could get before he pulled up beside them. They left the last houses behind. Hawthorn hedges and an occasional ash tree hid the fields that bordered the road. Through one gate, they saw a herd of cows, through another, rows of barley. The afternoon was warm and still. Only a few leaves fringed with brown hinted at autumn. Gnats hung in listless clouds above the tarmac. Zoe was the one who spotted something through the hedge. She had a gift for finding things, birds' nests, their mother's calculator, a missing book, a secret. "What's that?" she demanded, stooping to peer through the tangled branches. The flash of red could have been poppies bordering the field, but the poppies had already lost their petals. Before her brothers could answer, she turned and ran back to the gate they had just passed. Matthew and Duncan watched her go. Zoe brought her knees high and pumped her arms. Last sports day, she had won the quarter-mile by almost 3 seconds. As she reached the gate, Duncan, without a word, took off after her. A car sped by, the smooth engine noise undercut by a harsh rattle. Matthew looked at the sky, mostly blue with a fortress of cumulus clouds in the east, and gave up on being the responsible one who waited for their father. The 2 bags, his and Zoe's, banged against the metal bars of the gate as he climbed over and jumped down onto the rutted ground. The field had recently been harvested, and circular bales of straw lay randomly across the dull gold stubble. In the middle of the field stood a magnificent oak tree in full leaf. He caught up, first with Duncan, then Zoe. From a distance, it was still possible to believe that the boy was asleep, lying on the grassy border between hedge and stubble. "Christ," whispered Zoe. The closer they got to him, the slower they walked. None of them spoke. Glinting blue bottles and smaller flies circled the boy. His hair was dark, his skin very pale. He wore a deep blue shirt, a color Duncan would later call cobalt, black shorts, and what appeared to be long red socks. At the local private school, the younger boys wore bright red knee socks, and for the briefest instant, Zoe thought, "Oh, he's in uniform." A few steps closer and she grasped the nature of the red. His eyelids were pale with a delicate tracery of veins. Everything that happened, they all three later agreed, was only possible because of those closed lids. His chest rose fractionally and fell fractionally. With no one to tell them what to feel, they did not cry out or exclaim. Zoe tiptoed forward, knelt down at a cautious distance, and leaned over to touch his bare arm, where it emerged below his shirt sleeve. His skin was reassuringly warm. He was a little older than her, 18, perhaps 19. "We need to get help," she said. But she was not going anywhere. She was gently stroking his bare arm.
Thank you, Margot. Beautiful. I think just listening to you makes me realize why this novel has received such wonderful praise, with words like exquisite and luminous. And I particularly like immersive, because that's how I felt reading this novel, just completely immersed in the lives of these three characters and of the town. So beautifully done. And listening to you again, I found myself thinking about directions I have often given to young writers who are embarking on a short novel. Sometimes short story writers, as you know, you can only induce them to write something longer if you promise them it can be a short novel. And I've often in classes asked the students to consider sort of the broad plot lines of three different kinds of short novels. One is a day in the life novel, 24 hours in a character's life. The other is a life, either from birth to death or from birth to a kind of coming of age. And the third is the inciting incident novel. And clearly, The Boy in the Field is an inciting incident novel. This boy is dropped down, it's right there. We don't wait for him. He's dropped as if from the sky and discovered by these three children. So we all are fascinated by origin stories. Was this your first image for the novel? Did you toy with introducing it later? What was this the thing that brought you to this story?
It was the first image, and it came to me courtesy of an acquaintance, someone who I had been at school with, although of course he was in the boys' school, and I hadn't seen him in many years when we met in New York, and I was asking him about his life, and he described how one summer afternoon, he'd come home to his house in the tiny, tiny village where he lived, a village where no one locked their doors, there was no crime. And at the bottom of the garden, there was the body of a young woman who had been murdered by her boyfriend. And it was an utterly horrifying spectacle to him, and it completely changed his life. And this was quite a number of years ago, in maybe 2010, 2012, but the image stayed with me, and the image of her legs covered in blood that reminded him of his school uniform stayed with me. And I just kept thinking about that. So it was almost like a picture in my mind that I wanted to hand over to other people's minds.
Which is what you do. One of the ways I try to describe that inciting incident novel form to students is probably more often than I should. I say, oh, picture the pebble in the still pond. The still pond, and then story, plot, scene, the inciting incident. And in this novel, it's not so much a pebble in a still pond. It's sort of more like the breaking ball in billiards. It's not so much that there are ripples out from the discovery of this boy. It really is the cue ball sort of breaking up and sending these three children in all different directions. And that really fascinates me, the way they don't respond in what you would think of as the usual logic of an inciting incident. I wonder if you can just talk about the three adolescents, young adults who discover the boy in the field, and who they are and how they are sent off in all these different directions.
Well, I thought of, I know you put it in such a good way, Alice. No, I don't think it's exactly like a stone dropped in a pool of water, because each of them has a real choice, I think, about how they respond. I mean, they could just carry on with their lives as usual, but each of them, their life sort of swerves in a new direction. In the case of Duncan, who's the youngest and who is adopted, he suddenly really realizes that he's adopted, and he realizes that he would like to find this person, his birth mother, if it's at all possible. He's devoted to his family, but still he would like to meet this person, have a conversation with her. And he's also an artist and very much in love with the painter Morandi. So he sees things in a particularly pristine way. Zoe, who's 15, nearly 16, she would tell you if she was here, although that's too childish for her, at that point in her life when, as Catherine Mansfield very beautifully describes, she's very much a part of the family, but she's also just struggling to be free, struggling to be her own person and to be seen as her own person. And she starts prowling the streets of Oxford, looking for someone who will see her in the way she hopes to be seen. And Matthew, the oldest, becomes a kind of quasi-detective. And I read a wonderful interview with a detective writer in the New Yorker, in which, I'm sorry, I forget her name, in which she talked about how the detective is the good person going into the valley of shadow. And I was very struck by that. And also by what it would be like to take on the reality of trying to solve a crime as an ordinary person. Is there really any hope of doing that?
Yeah, and of course we have the real detective who shows up, Hugh Price, who comes to the door after the children have gone home after this discovery. And as soon as he appeared, my first time reading through the novel, I thought of An Inspector Calls, the J.B. Priestley play, the quintessential British detective. And, you know, in that play, I think it's his final words or one of his final speeches that the detective makes as he turns to the people, and he has connected this whole family to the death of a single young woman. And after he's made all these connections, he tells them, we are responsible for one another, sort of the lesson. And I suppose initially I thought that's what you was going to do. Again, sort of making the connection, those ripples out from this. And he does quite the opposite. Actually, he separates the children. He doesn't make them connect at all. He interviews them individually. He hears, they each have a different version of the one word that the boy in the field has said. I'll let you describe that. But he doesn't act as the detective, the Sherlock Holmes who connects all the dots. In some ways, he's part of this spreading, this incident that sends all the children and the family off in their different directions. I think at one point Matthew says, my family is in disarray. And in some ways, your detective going against type is part of that disarray.
Yeah, he was not someone I thought of being in the novel when I began writing. I wasn't writing a murder story. I wasn't writing a detective story, so I didn't need a detective. But I really felt there was a need for an adult presence who was not the parent, who could be a little outside the situation and could be a confidant for Matthew in his quest to find the boy's assailant. And Hugh Price very much evolved for me, and it grew out of that interview I had read about the role of the detective in contemporary fiction.
And it does, you very quickly, I think, let the reader know that this is not a detective story and that you're going to be confounding all the tropes that we expect. And one of those things that really fascinates me is that the boy in the field doesn't introduce menace to these children's lives. They have a happy family. They live in a lovely little town outside of Oxford. All the co-op and the butcher store and all the lovely things that we like to think about of small town life in England. And yet you make it very clear early on that there's a sense of menace even before they encounter the boy in the field. Matthew has a friend who is obviously, her father is abusive, who has moved away, but he's seen that menace of the adult world. Zoe is composing a poem in the cemetery for her grandfather, and a flasher shows up. This happens before. So it's not as if there's a loss of innocence at all, that there's been this encroaching sense of menace that the boy in the field is in some ways part of, but also apart from. And that made me very curious about, especially early on in the novel, that sense of these kids being at risk or in their not quite adulthood, that they're at risk. Did you have that sense?
I did want to suggest that the world is a dangerous place. You know, when Zoe's mother tries to warn her and her friend about people who may make advances to them. I mean, Zoe and her friend just giggle and say, "Oh, how silly!" But you know, the world is full of perils and dangers, and the image of the boy is a confounding one in some ways, because it's an image of beauty and also of harm. Those two things sort of inextricably tied together, and I think that's what is so disturbing about it and so confounding. And later we learn that the boy has very thin eyelids, a detail I stole from Hemingway, who claimed that he could see everything with his eyes shut, which I always thought was wonderful and spooky. And there's something about the sense that he's aware, that we later learn that he's aware of them too in a complicated way.
And that goes back to Duncan, the youngest, the adopted child, who is the artist. He's born of a Turkish mother. In some ways, he's the moral heart, yes, of the story. He has a beautiful way of looking at the world. Of course, he's observant, colors and images. His obsession with Morandi, with that sense of the same thing seen again and again and again. But he also has as a companion a very delightful not talking dog, but thinking dog.
Definitely a thinking dog.
It's just delightful. And I wonder if you could just read a little bit from Duncan's point of view about searching. He's lost his dachshund, and in some ways because of what he's seen, not only that he determines that he wants to find his birth mother, but even as a part of that, he determines he's ready for a new pet. Do you want to read just that scene? It's so delightful.
Oh, I do, Alice. Thank you. During his brief period as a Boy Scout, Duncan had learned that the compass has 32 points. Now he could say with confidence that each person in his family was heading toward a different one. Matthew was spending hours with Rachel, who was pretty and principled, but not kind. Zoe was searching for something. She didn't seem to know what or whom. His father was nicer when he was around, but he was around less. His mother, between her cases and her ancient Greek, was always busy. Several afternoons a week, Duncan opened the front door and entered an empty house. By mid-October, he couldn't bear it. He found his father standing on a chair in the sitting room, putting up a new curtain rod. "We need a dog," Duncan said. "But after Arthur," his father moved the bracket to the left, "you said you never wanted another dog." "That was how I felt then. Now I feel differently." Duncan remembered every minute of the afternoon he had come home from school to find Arthur in his basket, refusing to go for a walk or even to eat. He had sat beside him, stroking the smooth curve of his head until Arthur was sleeping soundly. His father had promised to take him to the vet in the morning if he wasn't better. "But I bet he will be," he said. Duncan had gone to bed, reassured, and woken a few hours later in terror. In the kitchen, he had known at once that Arthur was gone. He spent the rest of the night sitting beside him, drawing picture after picture. The next morning, they had buried him under one of the laburnum trees, wrapped in his blanket. "Let me get these screws in," his father said, the drill word 3 times. He got down from the chair, moved it to the other side of the window, and climbed up again. "Should we look for a dachshund?" "No, that would make me miss Arthur even more." On Sunday, they drove to the animal rescue. Duncan had imagined it like an orphanage, barred windows, the dogs thin and miserable, the air rancid. But as soon as they came into the clean, bright room, he could tell the animals were well treated. Cats to the left, dogs to the right. Each was in its own pen behind a grill with a bed and toys and food and water. Each had a biography. "Charlie Boy likes children over 5 and regular walks. Rita has retired from greyhound racing. She needs a large garden and a stable home. Max gets nervous if people stare at him, but is friendly." Almost all the dogs came over to smile at Duncan. Most of them stood on their hind legs. If only he could pat them, but every few yards there were signs about not touching. He walked around the U-shaped corridor, stopping at each pen and back again. He wanted the lurcher, he wanted the terrier, he wanted the spaniel and the beagle. It would be awful to choose one and leave the others behind.
My sentiments exactly, Duncan.
Never go to an animal rescue.
Listening to you made me think about the role the parents play. I think one of the really part of what makes this novel so immersive and one of the really marvelous things that you're able to do is that while you have the sense with these three voices of the three children, and you do have the sense that they're each going off in their own directions, just as Duncan said too, the points of the compass. And yet there's a continuous sense of the family unit. The parents are not completely missing. These are not Peanuts characters who have no adults in their world. And there were a number of times that I'd be deep in Zoe or Matthew or Duncan's sections, and then they would be called to dinner, and I was, oh, that's right, they're home. There's a family, or they smelled dinner's being cooked, and Dad's there. So there's this wonderful sense of each of them claiming his or her own personality and own pursuits and own life, without that marvelous sense of security of the family unit, even though it is kind of threatened, but never breaking apart, and still the place they return to, even if it's an empty home, as you just described with Duncan. They still speak to their parents, which is very reassuring. But it's just a lovely sense of family, the rhythms of family life. And that brings me to another thing that Duncan so beautifully does, that understanding that he wants to find his birth mother. He imagines beautiful rooms, but in the same house, rooms that in his home that he hasn't discovered. And I just love that image. If you could talk a little bit about that.
Well, I think it's quite a popular recurrent dream, or at least, it's certainly a dream I've had and other people I've spoken to, that you're in a familiar house and suddenly there is this unexpected, wonderful space that you were so glad to find, and are a little shocked you haven't found before. And some of those dreams have been so vivid for me that I could draw them, I can picture them, and I can sometimes return to them. So I thought of Duncan looking for his mother, that it's this imaginary room. He wants to open the door and step in, but he doesn't want to leave the familiar house. He wants to continue in this home he's known all his life, with the cactuses on the windowsill and Lily confiding in him or suggesting what he should think or do, and going swimming on Saturdays and asking for oil paints. He wants to continue in that. But I always think it's so interesting. I mean, I am an only child, but I'm also part of this adopted family, and I'm always so interested in how my siblings experience the family so differently, and their stories are often very much at odds while at the same time very connected.
Yes, each one in his or her own room, but still called together. And it was so refreshing to find that this is still a complicated family, but they've done no harm. Thank goodness, here's a family that is still loving and forgiving. And patient, and they have their secrets. At one point, I think it's the detective who talks to Matthew about the locked room mystery, and that the brain is the greatest locked room mystery. And what I really loved is that this novel is able to to sort of pay homage and to recognize the importance of relationships and closeness and affection, without ever saying that these people fully understand each other. And in some ways, it's a celebration of that as much as it's an examination of that kind of how we are isolated, how we are each telling our own stories, even if they're about the same experience. I think that's an amazing accomplishment of this novel. And as it happens, I found as a reader, the mystery, what happened to the boy in the field, although it's still there, and I'm with Matthew, as it becomes less and less important. And as a matter of fact, when it's finally revealed, it seems not the denouement that we've been waiting for, just a little bit more information.
And one of the things I decided was that my three teenagers I wanted the novel to be very firmly rooted in 1999, but I also wanted it to have a slightly timeless quality. And my three teenagers don't, for the most part, swear or behave that badly, or, I mean, at various times they all disobey their parents and do things they shouldn't, but they don't curse, and they aren't bolshy about things, and they do the dishes, and which maybe makes them seem a little idealized, but was something I felt like I needed for the tone of the novel and for the novel to get where I wanted it to get to.
Well, I think you're able to do that because each one is so much his or her own person, and they do all have their secrets. And they also have a father who has his secret that they eventually share. There's a wonderful line at the end. The mother, who probably is she's there, but more as a presence. She is very busy. She's a solicitor. She's studying Greek. So she's there as a presence more than as an active part. The father's driving them around and making dinner and seems more taking care of things. But at the end, she's having a conversation with Zoe, and Zoe asks her, "Do you think there are things a person can do that are unforgivable?" And being a solicitor, the mother says, "You mean non-criminal things?" And then, to be honest, I'm not sure I know what forgiveness is. You hold something in your mind without anger. Is that forgiveness? Which is about one of the loveliest descriptions. And I would say to her, yeah, that sounds exactly right. But it also emphasizes that locked room. That idea that what's really happening here in this novel is about the interior lives of these characters, what they're seeing, not so much what happens to them.
No, I wanted to write a short novel in which a great deal happened, but perhaps you might at first almost not realize how much had happened, how much plot there is. Mm-hmm. Because it's all mediated through the characters. And in that way, it's perhaps the opposite of the traditional detective story in which the plot is forcing the characters into certain situations.
Yes, and even when the detective has finally got his man, and again reveals what I won't reveal here, but what Matthew wants to know. And then the detective, very much against type, pretty much says, I don't really care if he gets punished. I don't really believe in punishment. I just love that. We just figured it out. And Matthew's wonderful response is, I just hate that it's so random.
Yeah. My small blow for the anti-incarceration movement. But yes, I mean, I think it's one of the most frustrating things about growing up is discovering how random things are. I notice with my neighbors' children, watching them grow up, how many rules there are. If you do this, this will happen. And if you don't do this, this will happen. And it makes the world seem comforting and safe. And then you discover, oh, this is all breaking down. We're keeping to the rules and it isn't helping.
It might be the child in all of us who read novels that I did read part of the novel thinking, yeah, there are rules, and then realized, no, Margot is smarter than that. It's much more complicated than finding out why is the boy in the field. I think we are going to move to some questions.
Yes. Here I am.
Hi there.
Hello. Okay, so to start us off, we've got a question from John who says, hello, Margot, compliments again. I'd be interested in anything you can say about the new novel's element of fable, something rather new for you.
Gosh, thank you, John. I was interested in trying to, I mean, I love readers like, sorry, I love readers. I do love readers, but I was going to say I love writers like Calvino and Helen Oyame and Angela Carter, people working in those kind of that borderline territory. And I mean, a fable seems too simple, but I did want to have something of the fable-like atmosphere, or maybe more accurately, a tale-like atmosphere, as the children move into adulthood. And I think that's one of the reasons I worked very hard to try to create pictures throughout the novel in certain scenes that the reader would see for herself and judge for herself.
Okay, this one is from Michael, and he says, Dear Margot, at Warren Wilson, you once asked us to read a novel by Gabriel Fielding titled In the Time of Green Bloom about a girl's murder, and I wonder if that book was on your mind at all while writing your new book. Cheers on the book.
What a good memory. Yes, I remember In the Time of Green Bloom, and I haven't read it in years and years, probably since I recommended it at Warren Wilson. I think that I felt some rebellion against the number of dead young women who seem to be needed in so many detective stories. There's so much violence against women in fiction, and I very much did not want that to happen in my novels. So perhaps I was writing against Gabriel Fielding rather than towards him, if that makes sense. What do you think, Alice? I mean, do you notice that young women are killed off more frequently?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no better way to sell a TV show or a novel is to start with the dead body of a beautiful young woman. It's the thing we can't seem to take our eyes from. And you know, I love what you say, because even Carol, the boy in the field, in many ways is not a victim, although he is literally the victim in your novel. He's not victimized, maybe is what the word I'm looking for. He's more than the body in the field, which I think, again, sort of takes the novel away from anything that we might expect from a summary, and makes it much more complex.
Okay, Pamela asks, what led you to set the novel in 1999? Did it have something to do with wanting to avoid having the teenagers entangled with social media, or were there other reasons?
Well, I remember that 1999, everybody thought something terrible might happen at the millennium, that planes would fall from the sky and computers would break down and all these awful things would happen. And of course, awful things were coming towards us, but not quite the ones we imagined. But a big part of it was that I needed to write a novel in which two things. I wanted to be able to imagine the children when they were older, and I wanted them to live their lives without mobile phones, so that they couldn't always be phoning adults for help when they had emergencies.
It also helps to make the search for Duncan's mother much more interesting and complex, that they didn't just Google her. There's actually much more tension in the possibility of finding his mother because of the lack of that technology.
That's true, yes.
Definitely. Okay, this question is from Carol, and I'll pose it to both of you. Has sheltering in place and the restrictions of the COVID virus affected your writing or your writing process?
Alice?
You know, I've mentioned to a number of people that those of us who read and write have the advantage in these times, not to make light of all the great suffering throughout the land. But we don't really have to go out to a bar. We can read a novel in which a character goes out to a bar and be perfectly satisfied. So for me, it just feels like a friend of mine said, who's also a writer, said he's a little bit resentful that the room of his own is suddenly occupied by everybody else who's also in the room of their own. But this is what we do. You know, as writers, we arrange our lives to avoid people so that we can get our work done. And now the world is arranging itself to avoid us.
And everyone is home. Yeah, no, I feel exactly the same, that I am fortunate to be able to do so much of what I love under the present circumstances. One of my first responses to the pandemic and to beginning to understand some of the implications was to immediately start writing a short novel that's a kind of love song to Scotland, because of course I always want to go there, and I particularly want to go there in the summer. And so I'm now going there in the only way I can, which is on the page. But that's certainly better than nothing.
For sure. Okay. This is a question from Gemma, who asks, what was most rewarding about writing this novel, and what part frustrated you the most?
What was most rewarding about writing the novel was at a certain point when I suddenly thought, oh, I can make this work. At various points, I had the feeling I might hit a wall or just run out of energy, or that I wouldn't be able to do this thing that I was hoping to do. And when I realized that I thought I could, that was fantastic. The hardest part was probably trying to modulate the ending in complicated ways, and I think endings have got harder and harder to write as the decades pass, because we want closure, but we don't want too much closure, because then that's artificial, and we don't want to give too much away, but we want to know some of the secrets. So I think there's a lot of negotiating around endings, and how to get to an ending that feels really resonant and satisfying. And I mean, I don't mean to claim that I'm sure I've done that, but I think it's got harder and harder to do that.
No, I think you have. And I really, I mean, for the craft alone, I so admired, because there's the wonderful scene, the second to last gathering of all the characters just before New Year's, the change of the millennium, and all the characters are there, and it's the salon, the village is having the salon of second chances, so everyone is dressed as who they might have been or would have liked to have been. So it's this greatly, beautifully orchestrated coming together of all the characters. And then I so admired that you had the guts to begin the final chapter with, and here's what happened 8 years later. Wow, you can do that. Margot did that. That is so wonderful. And that here's what happened 8 years later, which is Duncan's student showing of his work. I don't think I'm giving anything away by saying the last image in the novel is the family gathered again. Not only that they're gathered around Duncan's work, but because they're gathered, strangers are being drawn to them. And I think that sense that exists throughout the novel of the family still as a center, as a shelter, as a place to come to, is reproduced in another time and another place, and yet just resonates so beautifully.
Okay, I'm gonna sort of combine two questions because they're both along the same lines. So Peter asks, Margot's lived in the US for a long time, yet she continues to set most or all of her wonderful novels in England and Scotland. Why is this? Can she imagine writing a novel set in the US? And we have another person who asked, what is the role of place in your novels?
Thank you. I did write a novel mostly set in America. My last novel, Mercury, was set mostly outside Boston. And in a number of novels, I've allowed characters to come to America, and they usually have a good time, and then they immediately head back to Britain again. I think one of the things is that there's just so many things that remain mysterious to me about America. Probably they're mysterious to most Americans, but there's a way in which when you grow up in a place, you're porous to certain things, and you experience all these kinds of things about class and race and relationships, all of this before the age of 20, that in a very intense way that's quite hard to reproduce. I think I will try to write more about America, but at the moment, America is changing shape so quickly that it's not a very inviting place to write about unless you either go forward in time, go for the dystopian, or go back in time, I would say.
Dystopian, not utopian.
That was definitely a slip of the tongue.
But it's also hard to imagine the utopian right now, for sure. Okay, we have two good questions that were posed to both of you. I'm going to start with this one from Juliana, who says, for both Alice and Margot, what helps sustain you when you're not sitting in front of the page? Long walks, gardening, plotting revenge on your enemies?
Ooh, that's a nice range of choices. I actually see my garden as one of my enemies. So I'm always plotting revenge on my garden because it's a thief of time, all these weeds springing up and all these things not doing what I want them to do. And I wish my garden were more docile, and I wish it was like a Scottish country garden. But I would say reading is hugely important to me. I could more easily give up writing than reading, I think, though I would hate to choose. And certainly going out into the world and looking at things, trying to find dogs that look like Lily. Alice, how about you?
I think maybe this is a COVID thing, but I find more and more what sustains me is thinking about the stories I'm going to write, because they're always so much better when you're just thinking about them. So it's the when you sit down and start working with words on the page, then it's, oh God, this is work. Oh, this is not quite as brilliant as I thought it was. But there's great pleasure in not being at your desk and living in a story in your head. We're back to the locked room of the brain, living through the story, imagining it. Oh, and you can see it so perfectly. It just had the right words. So I think that's the thing that actually brings me back to the page. there's all the distractions of life, but I had this great idea for that scene or that character, and boy, if I only can keep hold of it until I get to my desk, and then of course it starts slipping out from under as soon as you start writing a sentence.
Okay, and along those lines, this is an anonymous attendee who asked for both Alice and Margot, have you read anything wonderful lately?
Yes, The Boy in the Field.
I'm reading two books that are very different. One is a Burning by Megha Majumdar.
Oh, it's so good.
I'm not sure if I'm saying her surname correctly. And the other is Jill McCorkle's wonderful new novel, Hieroglyphics. And both are a deep pleasure, and I keep them in different rooms. They serve slightly different functions in my life, but both are wonderful.
Yes, I've just begun Jill's book myself, and it's wonderful. Again, it's that immersing yourself into a wonderful tale with a wonderful writer, and hearing the voice and saying, yeah, that's all I need. Just a book and a chair.
Okay, so I'm gonna end, I think, on a technique question. This is from Joseph, who says, thanks for a wonderful conversation. May I ask a question about technique? As Alice said, much of the plot is interior, certain elements seeming almost buried or obscured. Did you have more material to start out with and then cut away as you progressed, or did you approach the composition in another way?
I approached the composition always thinking about the larger story. So I didn't, as I went back and forth between my three teenagers, I didn't think, oh, now it's Zoe's turn. I just thought the larger story needs such and such. I did have a lot of material that I cut away with the help of my wonderful friend, Andrea Barrett, who reads almost everything I write that's longer than a postcard and tells me how to make it better. I had a whole section set in the hospital where the boy in the field works, and that turned out to be a complete mistake. But yes, I think almost all my novels have involved significant recycling.
I think it's wonderful. If we have a minute, we've talked about this before, how Andrea Barrett, a marvelous fiction writer herself, has been reading your work, and I'm so fascinated. Clearly having another writer, especially a writer like Andrea, looking at your novel is very different from working with an editor. Or certainly very different from what a writer in a workshop gives to aspiring writers or students. How does that work? It fascinates me.
Well, I think for the first couple of years, we were just dreadfully polite with each other. And we would say all kinds of nice things and then say the thing we really wanted to say. And over the years, we have reached I think we're still very, very civil, but we get much more quickly to saying something like, do you really need these 30 pages set on a pig farm? Helpful comments like that. And I think one of the wonderful things is that, I mean, my editor, Jennifer, is fantastic. But one of the wonderful things about working with Andrea is that I can talk to her about quite embryonic things and say, so should I set this in a Scottish castle, or would it be better to try the Tuscan countryside this time? Or, I can talk things over. It's like sharing my brain with someone. Do you have someone you can, I mean, you've had the same editor for, well, I think since A Bigamous Stranger.
Forever, yeah. No, maybe this is why I'm so taken by the locked room of the brain in The Boy in the Field. That's where I keep it as locked. I keep my stories locked in my brain for as long as possible.
Well, Thank you both. Thank you, Alice and Margot, for this wonderful conversation. It was so great to hear more about this book. And thank you to everyone out there for joining us and spending your Wednesday evening with us. I invite you to purchase and check out The Boy in the Field at harvard.com, learn more about this remarkable novel. And from Harvard Bookstore here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, have a great night, keep reading, and stay safe. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Lauren and Harvard Bookshop.
Thanks, Margot. Good night.
Thank you both. Good night.
Good night.